course, as we were getting into the end of the last talk, the notion that we are free beings, that we have the capacity to make free choices, is a very deep one in our sense of who we are and the meaning of our lives. It is, of course, also more specifically in terms of justice and morality and ethics in general, absolutely an essential assumption. And one has to only think of things like moral or even legal responsibility to register that. I mean, that is, if the things that we do couldn't have been otherwise, that is, if anything I do is entirely determined by antecedent causes over which I have no control, then it would seem that I cannot be held responsible for my actions. That is, to punish somebody or to simply hold them or give them moral blame or lay moral blame on them seems to assume that people people could have done otherwise. That is, the notion that people can be held responsible for their actions assumes that people could have done otherwise than they did. He gives an example of the absurdity, perhaps, of blaming somebody for drowning. You know, drowning is not something that you do. Drowning is something that happens to you. You cannot be held responsible for what's happening to you, in the way that you can be held responsible for things that you do, and things that you do are things that you freely choose to do. But what if everything that you seem to do is really something that happens to you? He quotes Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher, and alludes to Wittgenstein. I think quotes Wittgenstein too, the 20th century Austrian philosopher, who both called into question the notion that there is a real difference between doing something and something happening to you. Wittgenstein talks about how a leaf blowing here and there may say, well, now I'll go here and now I'll go there, and it may seem to the leaf that it's choosing to float here and there, but really it's forces, the wind, forcing it to go here and there. So really the leaf isn't doing anything. Things are happening to the leaf, but it appears, I know it's kind of silly, to the leaf that it's doing things. So again, it's obviously a very important issue, and we're partial to it in the sense that we want to continue to think that we're free beings for all sorts of reasons. But you know, the question does remain, and just because we want to think of ourselves as free beings, and just because lots and lots about our culture and our way of living as human beings depends upon us being free beings, does not mean we are free beings, right? And this is where, you know, you sort of have to make a distinction between what is true as opposed to what we really want and maybe even need to be true. And of course, okay, so last time we talked about the hard determinists or the incompatibilists, the ones who believe that determinism and freedom were incompatible. You couldn't have both. You had to choose one or the other. And if you're a determinist, obviously you've chosen determinism over freedom. But what about compatibilists? What about the idea that determinism, the idea that every event is the upshot of antecedent causes, and freedom are compatible? What's that argument? Well, let's again be a little more specific about what we mean by a free act. And let's confine ourselves to this, that a free act is one which could have been otherwise. That is, that someone does something, but they could have done otherwise. They could have done something else instead. If we can establish that, that is, that, okay, I did something, but I could have done something entirely different. If I can establish that, then I can establish that I have freedom, because I've established that my act is not entirely determined by antecedent causes, because although this is what I did, I could have done something else. If my act is entirely determined by antecedent causes, then I couldn't have done anything else. So what does the compatibilist say? Well, he gives an example of how a compatibilist may account for that could have done otherwise by comparing the human mind's decision-making process to a computer program with different functions. And this is what's going on pages 91 and 92, where he has a schematic on page 92 of if we, again, thought of the human decision-making process along the lines of how a computer actually, kind of makes a decision. The scanner, the tree producer, the evaluator, and the producer, where different parts of the program, make inputs available, make different. The tree producer would be the different outcomes that are available given the information. The evaluator picks the outcome that is optimal, and then the producer actually determines which outcome to pursue. That if we thought of the human mind that way, as making decisions like a computer program, then perhaps we could think of ourselves as free in the following sense. Certainly the way that we're programmed, and this is of course thinking along the analogy of a computer or software actually, certainly the way we are programmed will produce a certain output, that is a certain decision. That is, given the trees that we produce, the outcomes that we see, and especially the evaluator, the one that determines which is the optimal, best outcome, the one that is most worthy to be pursued, that given these programs, we're going to do something. That is, we're going to follow that program. But crucially, the program could be different, and the program is different for different people, and the program is different for people at different times. Gives the example of teachers thinking they rather have a lazy student than a stupid student. It's not a very nice way to put it, actually. I don't think I've ever had an actual stupid student. I've had lazy ones, but I'm a lazy teacher, so I certainly wouldn't point the finger at them. I mean, we all got to come up with something here for this class, but laziness, why is it that if somebody is just unintelligent, and again, I'm not sure that that's really true, but if somebody just lacks the mental capacity to do the work, you do not blame them. Feel sorry for them. But if someone does not do the required work because they're lazy, then you do blame them. And how do you make sense of that? Well, what you say is that if somebody lacks a capacity, a physical or mental capacity to do something, it is not something that they can be blamed for. But if somebody fails to do something that they do have the capacity for because of some other character trait like laziness, then we do blame them. But that only makes sense if they could have been otherwise. And one of the things that we see is that things like laziness as opposed to lack of intelligence, and we can think of it in a physical capacity. Say that I'm a bad basketball player, and I am, and that's because I don't have any talent. Now, maybe I used to, when I was young, be a little better, but certainly now it's all over for me. So if I were to get out there on the court with a bunch of good basketball players, they wouldn't blame me for my bad play. They would just feel sorry for me because I'm just not good. I don't have the capacity. But if one of them, let's say, a regular, good basketball player, was not playing well, and it was clear it's because they hadn't been practicing, let's say, the jump shot was off because they hadn't been playing much, then it may make sense to, why not blame them, but to say, well, it's your responsibility. You're not playing well because you didn't practice. Those sort of distinctions are quite important. Now, if we think of the decision-making process in this compatibilist, so-called compatibilist way, yes, what we do is more or less determined, it seems, by our so-called programming. However, our programming could have been different and could be different. That is, we could change the programming. We can change the programming. That is, so we can change because we can change our character. I hope that that's a fair interpretation of what he is saying in terms of so-called compatibilism. Yes, our decisions are determined by antecedent causes, but the most important antecedent causes are our own, let's say, our programming. But our programming could have been different, and we have a hand at our programming. As the things that we do and the influences we have, as well as the influences we have, determine that programming. And we can change that programming. That is, So I think that's something we would all sort of agree to, is that we can change our habits, we can change our lives, we can change to a certain extent, the type of people we are. To the what extent we can do that is a question. So I think that is an important distinction, the distinction between not having the capacity on the one hand and to do something, and just not doing it because of some other character trait that prevents one from doing it. In the first case, we cannot change it. In the second case, we can. So does this establish that, to some degree at least, we do have free will, and that given the truth of determinism, that is, given the truth that every event that happens in the universe happens as the upshot of antecedent causes, is that actually compatible with our notion that we are free, that in the sense that the things that we do, some of the things we could have done differently.